All right, good morning, Calvary, and hope you're doing well here on this frigid Monday morning. Got a few, just two questions from the sermon this past Sunday, and let's see if we can just jump into these and give them a shot. All right, so first question. Today's preaching was good, thank you very much. I wonder about, in our time, what laws people are breaking that Jesus would not condemn. And good question. So I don't know if I'm going to get too specific on this, but I'll frame it up like this. So in the Old Testament law, I didn't quite go into these details on Sunday, but in the Old Testament law, there were three kind of main types of laws I mentioned. There was civil laws related to the kind of political structure of ancient Israel. There were ceremonial religious laws about how you handled sacrifices and what the cleanliness laws were and what the temple should look like and how the priests should do their duty. And then there were moral laws. And don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't commit adultery, these sorts of things. All right, so when we think about these three kinds of laws, right, the moral laws are universal. So whether or not you are in ancient Israel, whether you're today, don't lie, don't steal, don't cheat, don't commit adultery, like those they have all the same applications across throughout history. Doesn't matter the culture, those are universal moral laws. And those are never abrogated. So when Jesus said that that his disciples were breaking the law but guiltless, he was not referring to the moral laws. At that point, he was referring to the ceremonial religious laws. So now ceremonial religious laws, those would have been related to the kind of worship in the temple, and the worship in the temple was foreshadowing the ministry of Christ when he came. So the ceremonial religious laws are not universal, they are not eternal. They were for a time as a foreshadowing to point towards the coming of Christ. The civil laws that were baked into the Mosaic covenant, those were particular to the nation of Israel in the days of their coming out of Egypt and the time in their land. And much that is written in the civil laws wouldn't have direct application to today either, because we here in America, we are not the nation of Israel, right? And so the civil laws don't have direct application. The ceremonial religious laws don't have direct application to today. But the moral laws still do have direct application for today. So in terms of what Jesus would condemn or would not condemn, I would say anything in the law, and here I'm talking the Jewish law, the Mosaic law, that was civil or that was ceremonial or religious, those things don't really apply anymore to today. I think we can learn things from those laws, and there's a lot of principles and implications that come from those laws, but they're not directly applied to today. The moral laws do have direct relevance and application for today. I don't think Jesus would in any way want to abrogate those, because those are the heart of the law. It's the spirit of the law is contained within the moral laws. Now, having said all that, I want to say one more thing, which is that in the world that God created, prior to the reign and tyranny of sin, the moral laws of God worked in conjunction with each other. So be true and be loving. These were always cohered together. So if you think about all my mechanical friends out there thinking about an engine is timed in such a way that when the valves are opening and closing, they don't hit the pistons, right? So you don't want the pistons as they go up and down to be smacking the valves. So the engine is timed so that when the pistons are coming up, the valves are closed, and when the pistons are down, the valves are open, and they don't whack into each other. That's what the world was like before sin. It was like a timed engine, so that all of the moral absolutes in the world worked in synergy with each other. They worked in unity. But when sin comes into the world, suddenly it's like an engine is out of time, and now these moral absolutes are bouncing into each other. And the world puts us in positions sometimes when we're forced into these places of having to prioritize one moral absolute or another. And this is just the reality of the world which we live in, which can be very difficult. And so what I would say is that in those times where we're forced into places where the moral absolutes are not as easy to figure out because they're not so synergistically sort of working in tandem with each other, I think what we learned from Jesus' teaching yesterday is that the law of love and mercy is the law that should take preeminence when we're having to kind of forced to choose between these moral absolutes. Now, that doesn't solve all the problems, and it's not as just though, well, let's just do everything that's loving and without regard to like morality or truth, because that can lead into all sorts of things that ultimately aren't loving in the long run, right? So there's not an easy answer in some of these things. But what I would say is that to go back to the root of like, why did God give us the law to begin with? He gave us the law so that we could be blessed. So as we bring law, or try to think about like which laws do we bring, right? We want to bring laws that bring blessing into the world as well. So that doesn't really answer the question as to which laws today in today's culture, Jesus would, in a sense, turn a different eye to. But hopefully that gives some general principles on that. All right, second question. Could you please explain more about how the intent of the law was to administer mercy? I'm struggling to see the connection from God's point of view. Okay, so this is a good question. Let me think about it or talk about it like this. So if you're a parent, or talking about this from the perspective of a parent, so many of the rules that we bring to our children, we would say and kind of consciously think this is for the good of our children, and it should be. But the truth is, so many of the rules that we bring are not just for the good of our children, they're for like our own good, right? So like we tell the kids to go to bed at 7:30 when they're young because they need their night's sleep, but also because we as parents, like we just can't have them running around in the house past 7:30 or whatever it might be, right? So like the laws are given not just for the kids' sake, but they're given for our sake as well. All right, that's not the way that God gives laws. Like God is not like stressing, like I need a good night's sleep and I got to get these kids to bed by 7:30, and so I'm going to make these rules that will be good for them, but it also really just makes my life easier. So when God is giving his rules, he's not giving his rules out of a posture of need that he has, which is how often we give rules. He's giving rules solely out of love in relation to our needs, the things that we need. All right. So having said all of that, sin comes into the world. The world we see in the days of Noah becomes so chaotic that God has to bring a flood, start the whole thing over. Then he starts it over. But even God's statement about the state of the world and humanity after the days of the flood is that there still is this innate impulse to do evil. All right, so the world then is not like it's not a happy utopian land, right, that God had created, right? So now the nations of the world are walking in darkness. And this is where God steps in with his law. And so as I mentioned in the sermon yesterday, that the Psalm 119 in particular is all about, the whole psalm, it's the largest psalm in the psalm, in the Psalter, and it's all about the goodness of God's law and how it's a blessing. And the Israelites will go on to say in Deuteronomy that, like, what other nation, right, can boast of having received the laws from God? And they see this as a great blessing because they know that they are living in a world that is bereft of guidance. And so I would just go back again to the point that I was making in the sermon, that we live in a world where we need guidance. And so God steps in to give us guidance because he loves us and is compassionate and has mercy towards us. So the laws then are meant to point us ultimately, so go back to what we talked about in our first question with the civil laws, the ceremonial religious laws, and then the moral laws. The laws that God gives to the nation of Israel in the Mosaic covenant are meant to provide some structure and some safety and stability in the midst of a world that is not always safe and structured. And so when you go back and you look at the civil laws and the ceremonial religious laws, particularly the civil laws, when you go back and look at those, you see that like God is beginning to take a world that is oppressive in its uses of power, and he is beginning to call people to use power in ways that are a blessing to the outsider, to the marginalized, and to the outcast. And so we begin to get laws that call for the humane treatment of servants and slaves. We begin to get laws that are calling for the humane treatment of immigrants and for women. And so we begin to see God instituting laws that are now sort of pulling back or working against the kind of tyranny of power that's in the world, and is calling for more humane treatment of the oppressed and the marginalized and the outcast. And so that is kind of baked into the civil laws and of the nation of Israel. And then those are kind of the form that we talked about a number of weeks ago that Christ then pours the substance into. And we begin to see the full flourishing of God's heart of mercy and compassion in the days of the new covenant and the coming of Christ. So God's whole intent in giving the law, the whole reason he does it, is because he sees that humanity is in a posture of need. And in wanting to help humanity, he gives his laws to provide guidance. All right, hope that helps. And you guys have a great week this week. Stay warm. It's cold out there. And we will see you on Sunday. Take care. Bye-bye.